All right. Next, building upon what Kevin said, or maybe not. No, we'll go into our talking about effects on fruits and vegetables and weather extremes. All right, so Emily and I are going to do this together. We're going to talk about what some of the potential effects will be with changing weather patterns or climate. If it gets warmer with excessive heat, we can cause issues with production and more pests. Of course, wetter, as Kevin was talking about, with the more the dew points, we have more disease. If we have wetter soils, nitrogen losses, more severe storms could lead to crop damage. Again, what Kevin's showing, it's nothing definitive there yet, but more variable weather. Good news is we probably won't see a increase in fall springs, but we certainly are having more open falls. All right, looking at cucurbit crops this past year, we had low pumpkin yields due to heat at the time of fruit set, and then wet weather with the hurricane that came in set in for increased diseases. In pickles and watermelons, we had continuing problems with Phytophthora capsicum. As you can see here, this has been an increasing problem, not only because with extra rain events, we're going to see more of this disease, but secondly, it's expanded its crop range, including snap beans now. Heat effects on cucurbits, we are reduced overall yield, oftentimes reduced quality, like crooks and nubs and pickles. And of course, sun scorch can be a major problem with storm events and opening up canopies and watermelons. We did a couple pickle trials over the last couple years, looking at Parthenic carpet pickles, and we're definitely seeing a trend with decreased yields as we get into the hotter period of the year. This is a trial that we did with Parthenic carpet cucumbers. We're planting them 4 planting dates this past year. And you can see the yields bounce around quite a bit, depending upon largely how much heat load that they have. Pollination disorders and vine crops, again, unfavorable weather conditions usually set these up, and you can see a wide range of fruiting problems with distortions and incomplete pollination. Of course, part of that issue is what the weather effects on bee flights are going to be. If you do get reduced bee flights during rainy, stormy weather, windy weather, then you're going to set yourself up for having some of these pollination issues. On tomatoes and peppers, what we're mainly, and Emily maybe expand upon this, is some are minimum temperatures. As Kevin said, overall, our minimum temperatures are increasing, but looking at the summer, where we have increases in the minimum temperatures, we get to a point where our fruiting vegetables like peppers and tomatoes are severely affected. So what are some of the issues? If we get 100 degrees for 2 days, we're going to get fruit set failure. In that 95%, 80 degrees and 80 degrees night, 95 today, we have reduced pollen. And then greater than 75 at night, we have pollen tube growth problems. And with high humidity, we get pollen shed is affected because we get pollen clumping. So you can see here where we've lost flowers. This is a slide from Jerry Bruce over at the University of Maryland, where we've lost flowers. This is during a hot period. We can also get these fruit deformities. We get angular flutes, lack of gel on hollow areas in fruits. Hollow heart in watermelon, hollowness in pickles, those are related to pollen issues. Then we're seeing fruit ripening issues. So we're seeing more of these. Part of it has to do with this, some of those high temperatures. The other is that we're growing a lot more tomatoes in high tunnels. They have excess heat loads during the summer. So this is one of our major issues, is the development of white tissue inside of tomatoes under these high temperatures, yellow shoulders, blotchy ripening. And this is a combination heat disorder where the root systems of the plants are too hot, particularly on black plastic mulch. And then it's also related to potassium uptake. So the fruit can look good on the outside and can look really bad on the inside. Blossom end rite is also a stress-related disorder with fluctuating moisture levels. A lot of this has to do with irrigation practices. This is a slide from Emily on a shade study she did with peppers, where we're seeing that the remarkable weight under shaded peppers and on no shade had about 3 times the yield. So showing the heat loading certainly was causing a loss in yield of marketable yield. With cold crops, we also see issues. Again, the average maximum temperatures in southern Delaware, we have seen in recent years an increase here. And looking at the different crops, the 3 that you see there, cauliflower, broccoli, and Brussels sprouts, are much more stress susceptible than cabbage. So we see issues like premature bolting. We see uneven floret development and rough heads. This goes back to when those heads are starting to form. If there's excess heat during that period, those newly laid down cells that would form the head, or some of them do not form properly. So there is a whole project in the East looking for breeding for stress tolerance in broccoli. It's called the Eastern Broccoli Project. They have breeding programs at Cornell and at Charleston in South Carolina, as well as commercial breeders such as Bejo and Syngenta. So this is what that unevenness looks like. We're also seeing an increase in Alternaria and bacterial head rots in recent years. You can see here. With cauliflower, you have this buttoning and ricing, and because it needs more even growing conditions, if you have more variable temperature and moisture conditions, you'll get these issues. Similar types of things in Brussels sprouts with premature expansion of the sprouts. Just to mention, Kevin mentioned that there hasn't been a lot of differences in fall springs. Unfortunately, we've had a couple fall springs in the last 5 years. The good news is the climate scientists I've listened to say this is going to settle down where we don't see a whole lot of difference. I think Kevin's data showed that we'll still have them, but there's not going to be an increased frequency. So with that, that's my contact information. I went through this very quickly because I want to get to Emily. And with that, if you have any questions, there are certainly other things like fruit cracking in tomatoes with storm events. It has been a major issue, particularly this past year. Increase in disease, very wet weather diseases such as bacterial spot in peppers and bacterial spot in tomato was bad this past year.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the vulnerabilities that we might expect, and some of which we're already seeing in legume vegetables and in sweet corn. So the legume vegetables that we grow in Delaware are peas, snap beans, and lima beans primarily. So those are what I'm going to be focusing on. And I'm just going to go through some of the things that we might expect, or some of the things that we're seeing, and how these crops are vulnerable to these events. So we've mentioned unpredictable spring weather, that it seems like the frost date, the last frost date is getting earlier, potentially towards the end of March, but then we have some uncertainty in that, and that makes it difficult to plan. So especially for peas, which are an early spring planted crop, some of the earliest peas get planted at the end of February, in some years. And if we have warm weather and those plants get pushed along in their maturity to a point that they're susceptible to freeze damage, and then we have a freeze event like we did this year on April 7th, or this past year on April 17th, then we can get freeze damaged plants. They'll get killed down to the base and they can regrow from the bottom, but you'll get uneven maturity and a lot of issues that will result in yield loss. Another thing that we have seen this year and in past years is if we have flowers open on peas during frost. So in some areas of the state, we had frost in early May, which was when some peas were blooming. And that can result in poor seed set, as you see here with those pods. So in some ways, the uncertainty about when our last frost date is going to be, and the fact that it's changing creates this situation, especially for these early spring planted crops like peas. Kevin talked about sort of the regional increase in large volume rain events. And so for peas and snap beans, they are very susceptible to various root pathogens, and flooding and ponding can increase those problems. So that's especially an issue if we get those events in the spring for peas. More likely, we seem to be getting them in the fall, which could affect harvest. We know that if you have harvest delays, you really don't want harvest delays in peas. Harvest delays in snap beans are not that great either, and lima beans are a little more tolerant of that. So when, especially during the establishment phase for peas and snap beans, you have potential for increased root rot problems with these large volume events. When we get into the harvest period, being able to get equipment into the field to get that harvest done can be an issue with the large volume rain events. Gordon mentioned some diseases in the crops that he was talking about and he did mention Phytophthora capsicum, which is a problem in cucurbits. It's also a problem for lima beans and snap beans. These are all pathogens that really love extremely wet weather. White mold requires long periods of soil wetness to get going. So when we have increased rainfall, and especially in later in the season, in the fall, maybe associated with hurricanes, we can expect to see greater incidence of white mold affecting snap beans and lima beans, downy mildew affecting lima beans, and pythium affecting both lima beans and snap beans. So then high temperatures, often something that comes to mind for peas. High temperatures as they're maturing can push maturity, which can cause quality loss if they don't get harvested in a timely fashion. You can also have yield loss because not only can you get poor pollination from a freeze event, but you can also get poor pollination resulting from heat stress during flowering for peas, just like you can for snap beans. So many of you know that I've done a lot of work recently with heat stress tolerance in snap beans and lima beans. For both of those crops, high nighttime temperatures are the factor that creates this yield loss problem. So I have some pictures here of 3 ways that you can get pretty much complete yield loss for snap beans related to nighttime high temperatures. So some plants, like this particular variety, just don't really make any pods. Those tiny hook-shaped pods that set recently are probably going to fall off and abort. So you can get no pods. And I should mention that these plants were all old enough that they had been flowering for long enough that they really should have had fully mature pods on them. You can get reflowering and some pods forming, just a few pods, but none of them marketable, like with this variety, or you can get fair number of pods, but they're all low quality pods with missing seeds. So this is the kind of stuff that results from high night temperatures just before flowering and during flowering in snap beans. And in lima beans, there's a similar plant there on the left is one that was exposed to heat stress. So it did not set pods. Instead, we got excessive vegetative growth. I should mention that we took the leaves off of these plants so that you could see what was going on. So that was a human caused leaf removal. But a plant that was not heat stressed, you have a lot of pods set, not so much vegetative growth. Gordon and I observed firsthand in a field situation some lima bean plants this year that looked a lot like this very heat stressed plant on the left, with lots of stems, lots of flowers, and no pods. So under less severe heat stress or heat stress followed by a period of favorable weather for pod set, you'll get delayed maturity in lima beans because they will keep flowering, unlike snap beans. And then warmer winter temperatures are going to cause increased problems with nematodes, especially we're seeing this with root knot nematode, which is a problem for lima beans and snap beans, just because there's a longer period where the soil's warm enough for the root knot nematodes to be active and increasing their populations. And we are not getting the weather that knocks them back. So I'll mention a few things with sweet corn. So again, with unpredictable spring weather, fall, spring, so planting very, very early sweet corn has always been risky, but unpredictability in when we're going to get our last frost might tempt you to really, really early. So those plantings are still going to be susceptible to damage from freezes, or soil emergence because of cold soils can result in stand loss to disease or insects. Processing sweet corn especially is pretty able to compensate for stand loss in terms of yield. For fresh market sweet corn, where you're basically getting one marketable ear per plant, there's not quite as much of an ability to compensate for loss of stand. The increased incidence of large volume rain events and flooding and ponding in fields can cause stand loss as well. And you really can't, there's not going to be a lot of yield compensation for this kind of stand loss where you have whole areas of the field that are flooded and drowned out. High temperatures can cause this leaf scald in corn, which depending on when this happens, this may or may not affect the yield or quality of the corn. But if you are, if this happens as the ears are filling, you can see decreased ear quality. There is genetic variation in the susceptibility of varieties to this kind of damage. And this chart here to the right is yields from 3 different plantings in the 2019 trial. The orange bars are from a planting that went in on May 21st, and so was maturing in July during a period when we had a lot of extremely hot and very dry weather. You can see that for most of the varieties, yield from that planting was the lowest of the 3 plantings. There are some varieties that did fairly well in that planting. And the marketable Yield loss is usually due not to an ear not forming, but those ears not being marketable. So you might have reduced ear diameter. So these two ears have the same number of rows, but this ear just is sort of shrimpy. So you see these three ears on the left that are reduced diameter, and they also have poor tip fill, or relatively poor tip fill, that is also related to pollination issues resulting from heat stress. Of course, you can get much more severe version of this where the ears are unquestionably unmarketable. But as I was doing this talk, I realized I need to stop being so vain and take more pictures of ugly produce and disasters. And then I was adding question mark to my presentation as Kevin was talking. So maybe we won't get an increased incidence of intense storms with wind, but sweet corn of the vegetable crops that we grow is particularly susceptible to damage from wind events and storms that can cause lodging. And if that happens at the wrong time in the season, then we've got problems. That was the end of what I had. So I guess we'll take questions.
Yeah, we have a minute or two for questions here. Any questions for Emily or myself? Just to mention that, well, I'll leave this for the next section. So, well, since we're just a few minutes early, I think we can go ahead because we do have the next part of our presentations is climate and extreme weather roundtable on how to manage some of these issues. We have Emily again. We have James Atkins, our irrigation engineer, Jared Atkins, our extension agronomist, Mark Van Gessel, our extension weed science specialist, and Dave Marble Jr. from the Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association of Delaware.